All right, it's week 9 in the NFL, and in honor of it being Halloween week, we're going to take a look at some of the spooky matchups in fantasy this week. Let's check them out. Welcome back to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. Thank you so much for checking it out. The fantasy playoff push is on. So these matchups matter for playoff seeding and to see if you're even going to make the playoffs or not. So let's take a look at the Bearish report and some of the tough matchups I see this week. And let's get started like we always do with the quarterbacks. Let's go. All right, the first quarterback in my Bearish report for week 9, Buffalo Bills quarterback Josh Allen. Now, the Chiefs have been 5th best against opposing quarterbacks in fantasy this season, and Allen's coming off 2 of his worst games of the season, throwing for a combined 343 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions, less than his week 1 total against the Ravens. Now, while it is at home and it's against the Chiefs, so I wouldn't put it past Allen to pull out a little MVP magic, it is a tough matchup this week. All right, the next quarterback on my Bearish report for week 9, the quarterback on the other side of the matchup with Allen, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes. Now, Mahomes has averaged 270 yards and 3 touchdowns over the past 3 games, but all 3 of those games were at home. And this week, the Chiefs are traveling to Buffalo to take on a Bills team that's given up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this season, and is only allowing just over 180 yards passing per game. So like Allen, Mahomes just has a tough matchup this week. The next quarterback on my Bearish report for week 9, Denver Broncos quarterback Bo Nix. Now, Nix has thrown 6 touchdowns and only 1 interception over the past 2 weeks. But this week, the Broncos are traveling to face the Texans defense that's been one of the best against opposing quarterbacks in fantasy all season, allowing just over 10 points per week, and the only team that's allowing less than 1 touchdown per game on the season. So it's a tough matchup this week for Nix. All right, let's talk about the first running back in my Bearish report for week 9, New Orleans Saints running back Alvin Kamara. The Rams have been one of the best teams against running backs all year. They're the only team to not allow a run of 20 yards or more on the season. And with rookie Tyler Show getting his first start of the season, I expect the Rams to try and shut down the run and put all the pressure on the rookie signal caller. All right, the next running back on my Bearish report for week 9, Atlanta Falcons running back Bijan Robinson. The Patriots are currently holding running backs to a 3.8 yards per carry average, 5th best in the league. And over the past 2 weeks, Robinson's averaged less than 3 yards per carry. So add that up, and it doesn't look like a good week for him to get back on track. All right, and the last running back on my Bearish report for week 9 is actually running backs, Jordan Mason and Aaron Jones from the Minnesota Vikings, both of which were outrushed by Xavier Scott last week. And this week they're traveling to Detroit to take on a Lions team that's one of 5 teams that's allowing less than 12 points to opposing running backs on the season. All right, the first wide receiver on my Bearish report for week 9, Denver Broncos wide receiver Courtland Sutton. Now, the Texans have allowed the fewest yards and points in the league so far this season, and they've only given up 3 touchdowns to wide receivers on the year. So I'm expecting a defensive class, which usually doesn't translate to a strong fantasy performance. All right, let's talk about the next wide receiver on my Bearish report in week 9. New England Patriots wide receiver Stephon Diggs. Now, after a couple red-hot weeks, Diggs has cooled off. And this week he faces a Falcons defense that's given up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. And Drake May's been pretty good at taking what the D gives him. And this week, that might not be Diggs. All right, and the last wideout on my Bearish report for week 9, Detroit Lions wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, although they didn't look like it last week against the Chargers, the Vikings D has been one of the best in the league against wideouts this season in fantasy. They've allowed the fewest catches and the 2nd fewest points inside the red zone. And I think they'll look to bounce back this week in a divisional matchup and do their best to shut down St. Brown. All right, let's talk tight ends on the Bearish report. And the first one up, Buffalo Bills tight end Dalton Kincaid. Now, the Chiefs are one of 4 teams allowing less than 5 points per week to the tight end position in fantasy, and one of only 3 teams allowing less than 1 point in the red zone per week. So it's going to be a tough matchup for Kincaid this week. All right, the next tight end on my Bearish report for week 9, Kansas City Chiefs tight end Travis Kelce. Now, the Bills are giving up less than 20 yards per week to tight ends and have given up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the position on the season at 3.1 points per week. So like Kincaid, Kelce's got a tough matchup this week. All right, the last player on my Bearish report for week 9, New England Patriots tight end Hunter Henry. Now, the Falcons have only allowed 12 receptions for 105 yards and 1 touchdown to tight ends for the entire season. That's just over 1 catch and just over 13 yards per week. So yes, I think there's better options at the tight end position than Henry this week. All right, that'll do it for the week 9 Bearish report on Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you haven't yet, go check out my Bullish report on the players I think have good matchups this week. I'll put a link up here. And don't forget, as always, check those lineups. Let's get ready for that playoff push. Let's go.